There we go. Everyone's in the room. Hello, everyone. Ooh, 120 participants today, y'all. We're getting it going. Welcome to this month's Local and Regional Food Systems Response to COVID webinar. We're so thankful to have you here today. I'm Lillian Brislin. I'm at the University of Kentucky, a rural sociologist. I've got a number of members from our team today, and you see our three illustrious panelists spotlighted for you. Dawn, if you want to go ahead and share the PowerPoint. We've got just a few introductory bits about our project. If this is your first webinar, you can, we'll give you a little bit of introduction to the work we do. If this is not your first rodeo, then you could maybe do this for me, but I'm gonna run through the spiel and then we'll get into it. So today's topic is emergency food, community food security, and the local food system. So the intersection between ensuring community food security during the COVID pandemic and how local and regional food systems are stepping up to sustain that need. And let's go to the next slide. And this is part of our year-long project done in cooperation and collaboration with USDA Agricultural Marketing Service and a number of our colleagues from Colorado State University and Penn State University's Northeast Center for Natural Resources. Gosh, I keep bungling that name. And then our team at the University of Kentucky. We have 16 communities of practice spread out across all of the many different market channels. I can't say all of them. So we have direct marketing, intermediated marketing, farm institution. We have state departments of agriculture. We have representatives from tribal and indigenous communities, trying to get as diverse an array of local regional food system stakeholders to understand how folks are adapting, innovating, and building resilience into our local food systems into a post-COVID era. And this webinar series is part of our public-facing effort to share our real-time learning with you all. Many of you we've learned through patch polls, are in higher ed or in cooperative extension, are working in community-based organizations. Some of you are policymakers. Some of you are local food system enthusiasts. We love you. So thanks for coming here to learn with us today. If you've joined a previous webinar, they're very conversational. We've got three incredible leaders who are doing work every day on the ground. I think they've probably all made some sort of food today for their communities. So we're honored to have them with us. Next slide. And as I mentioned earlier, today we're really looking at that intersection between emergency food. So these could be food banks, these could be meal programs, feeding kids, feeding seniors, and how we tend to the most vulnerable among us in a time of disruption and a challenging time. And so we're going to learn from the experiences of these leaders. Next slide. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Don Filmini from Colorado State. Also, as part of this national initiative, we're doing other research pieces. So you're going to hear about a consumer survey that our project has done to help our local regional food system leaders and one of the innovations that we've gleaned from our leaders. So take it away, Don.
Yeah, great. That is one thing we're really trying to highlight is how pieces of this project have really come together to reinforce each other. So we did a consumer survey this fall that just ended in October. And as part of that, although we're mostly focusing on how people's food purchasing habits changed, we also knew just from talking to our partners that there was a lot changing in the food access and security realm as well. So first, we kind of asked, as you see to the left-hand side, how many people were economically really impacted by the COVID event? And this is a survey of about 5,000 Americans, so we feel like it's pretty representative. And you can see a large chunk of people did, for various reasons, really see an impact in their household. And so we knew that meant we should follow up with how is it affecting how confident they feel they can be in feeding their families. And what we're seeing is somewhere between 15 and 30% of households in very different ways are feeling some kind of impact and allowing them to feel confident about feeding their families in a secure way. And so given that such a large chunk of households have felt an economic impact and are feeling that they need to change their strategies to make sure their families are secure, we know that this is a timely webinar. And although we're seeing a lot of them reach out and use some of those new resources like food pantries and SNAP that are new to their household, and they're being used far more often by those food insecure households, we still know there's a gap there. And a lot of the focus of this webinar is some creative ways communities are finding to fill that gap. And so one other example besides the ones you'll hear about today is an innovation brief that was just posted on the website that looks at where the Wallace Center has been working with food hubs across the country who have always been there trying to help develop markets, but they really found this was an opportunity that in addition to developing for-profit markets, they also wanted to do their best to help the food insecure. So one really great example they have is they basically built a community-supported agriculture program that had two great outcomes. One, it helped to support and get some cash flow revenue to BIPAC farmers who also have been really lifted up as somewhere we could be providing better support. And then those CSA shares were distributed to local emergency assistance to food insecure households. So it kind of hit on two of the key issues we're really seeing struggles within the farm and food system. And it's just one example, including this one and the ones you'll hear about today, where we're seeing the local and regional food systems really step in and find community-based solutions. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Lillian to lead this really great discussion, but we also invite you to go to the website and explore some of those other resources in the same area. Thank you, Lillian.
Thanks, Dawn. I'm actually going to pass it over to Jeff O'Hara. One of our goals of this project is building bridges and connections across local and regional food systems. So from researchers, our leaders in the field, and our colleagues at AMS. So to get a USDA representative, Jeff's going to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Lillian. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jeff O'Hara. I'm an analyst with the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Agricultural Marketing Service. I live in Alexandria, Virginia, right outside of D.C. Really thrilled to have met and gotten to know three new people as we plan for this webinar. I'm going to introduce them and their titles, and then we have some pictures that we've put up, and maybe as they give a couple opening remarks about them, we can show those pictures as they're providing them. Our first guest, Latoya M. Meters, who's the Director of Operations from Collective Fare in New York. We're also joined by Leandra Foreman, who is the Operations Manager at Food Chain in Lexington, Kentucky. And I was privileged enough to have gotten a tour of Food Chain about a year ago. And finally, we also have Mary Green Trottier, who wears a few hats. She's the President of the National Association of Food Distribution Programs on Indian Reservations, and also represents the Spirit Lake Sioux Nation in North Dakota. So if we could flip to the Collective Fare slides, Latoya, maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your organization.
Absolutely. So Collective Fare started out as a culinary health and wealth training, full service catering, workforce development, and consulting firm. We spun out of the Brownsville Community Culinary Center, which was a 40-week nonprofit culinary training program, which my partner, Chef Femi Rodney Frazier, and I wrote the curriculum for and trained over 150 students. And along with the Brownsville Community Culinary Center, got those students into some amazing jobs throughout New York City and upper echelon restaurants. When the COVID pandemic hit, Collective Fare suffered greatly. We lost a bit of, not a bit, a lot of income to help us sustain our program. We also decided that, you know, we're located in Brownsville, Brooklyn, which is an underserved community. And we noticed that with the COVID pandemic, there's going to be a lot of stuff that went on. So we decided to turn our catering company into a food hub. And we partnered with a great many of community organizations. We provided hot, fresh meals. We provide fresh produce and everything in between. We've since started doing virtual training again, but the fight still rages on.
Perfect. Thanks, Latoya. And we're going to dig into the details of some of those new programs and pivots when we get into the meat of it. Let's go to the next slide, and I believe it's Leandra's up. Full disclosure, I am also a Lexingtonian, and so Leandra's a friend and colleague, and I'm so honored to have her here today.
Thank you so much, Lily. I'm really excited to be here as well. So like Lily said, my name is Leandra. I work here at Food Chain in Lexington, Kentucky. Food Chain is a nonprofit that's been around since 2011. Our mission is to forge links between our community and fresh food with demonstration and education of sustainable food systems. That kind of gives us a window to interpret that demonstration as loosely as we want. So we really just strive to find all the different ways that our community can learn how to connect more deeply with fresh, local, sustainable food and food justice. So what that's looked like is Food Chain originally started as an indoor aquaponics farm that did education around that sustainable method of growing. And then in 2017 grew to include a teaching and processing kitchen that did education for youth, seniors, and refugees around fresh seasonal produce and how to use that in ways that were nutritious and delicious. And then we also had a workforce development program in that kitchen that focused on unemployed and underemployed residents and connecting them to the diversity of work in the food sector. And then besides that, we also partnered with farmers as well as organizations in Central Kentucky to bring in Seconds Produce and process that for season extension to make that more accessible for families experiencing food insecurity, as well as average consumers who care deeply about supporting the local food system, but may struggle with that in the off season. So all of those programs are still going on in some ways with COVID, but we have adapted to now be a emergency food hot meal distributor, and as well as a connector between our local restaurants and caterers to contract meals made by small businesses to provide a hot, nutritious meal to families who are experiencing food insecurity or experiencing any kind of need for food in this time. So I know we'll go into that in more detail, but that's the way we've pivoted since the onset of COVID-19.
Thanks, Leandra. And finally, we'll get to Mary Green-Trottier from the Spirit Lake Sioux Tribe.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Mary Green-Trottier, and I'm a tribal member from the Spirit Lake Food Distribution Program, located in Upper North Dakota. We're about 85 miles from the Canadian border. As the president of the Food Distribution Program, we provide food to probably around 90,000 participants. Food Distribution Program is an alternative to the SNAP program. And it's an alternative so for people that don't have access to the local grocery stores. We provide home delivery. There's programs that provide tailgating to very rural, underserved economic areas. And I also operate the Commodity Supplemental Food Program. There are 4 of them operating in tribal communities.
Gosh, I just committed the cardinal sin of leaving myself on mute. So we can close the PowerPoint now, thank you. And we'll go to the upcoming webinars at the end of the presentation. So here's a teaser and I'll remind you all of what's coming up later. So, perfect. We've got a sort of 4 buckets that we run our conversations through. What was the pivot? What have you learned in the doing? What partners have been really helpful for you along the way? And what do you see carrying forward as we move into a new future? I don't know if post-COVID will ever be a thing, but we're thinking about it. So that's the structure of the conversation today. If you have clarifying questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat and I'll try to keep an eye on them, but maybe also my colleagues can chime in if they see one that's clarifying, and we'll also have a Q&A session at the end. I also put a message in the chat about availability of this recording and other information afterwards. So that's all the housekeeping, and let's get into it. And we'll start with Latoya. Gosh, it didn't occur to me. My mother actually attended a public cooking school in Chicago. If anyone's from Chicago and knows Washburn Academy when it still existed. And so I have a real place in my heart for nonprofit and public culinary training programs. But your collective fare, as we heard, runs a restaurant, catering, food distribution, nutrition education, job training, employment, and now other things. And all of those sectors, as you mentioned, have just been profoundly hit by the COVID pandemic. So what were some of the specific COVID pivots that you all put in place? And how does your thinking about community food security, how did that come to the fore? How has your thinking changed around that? You're on mute. And all of our panelists could come off mute, so we'll,
Sorry.
we'll save each other.
Keep in mind, a lot of people are thinking of this COVID pandemic and this food situation as a new situation. All COVID did was exacerbate a situation that we've already been in for the past 50, 60 years. It showed that there are flaws in our food chain. There are flaws in the way that we eat food here in America. There are flaws in the way that food is distributed here in America. And all that when everybody had to stay home, and it showed us that there's something that needs to be fixed. Collective Fare was already working towards a few initiatives in our community. We're partnered with a few organizations such as Team for Food Justice, in which we have our Brownsville Fresh Food Box, which we wanted to create something that, because in New York, we have a very short growing season, but we wanted to create produce, which would be available year round. Farmers markets in New York shut down at around maybe around October. So throughout the winter, we don't really have a lot of access to fresh produce. So we partnered with TFFJ, which has hydroponic farms, Grow NYC, which has access to hydroponic farms, and we created what we call the Brownsville Fresh Food Box, which is a bag of fresh produce, which I get to pick every week. What goes in the bag, it's $10 cash, $7 SNAP or EBT. We wanted to create something that was accessible to those people that have the SNAP benefits, but also to retrain how to use those SNAP benefits. Because we have another great many of people that they have access to SNAP, but maybe they don't quite understand how to spend that money. We tend to load up at the beginning of the month, which is high processed foods, but we don't think about how do I take that money and use it towards sustainable types of food and fresh produce. So there's a bit of education that involved. Collective Fare has always been sort of going with the ebb and flow of how our organization functions in our community. A full service catering company, when we first started that was because we realized that we wanted to create something that kept jobs within Brownsville, but also and for the people in the community, but also showed the talent that comes from the community and the ability to cook and to learn and for everyone to show their expertise. We have a great many chefs that work along with us. Due to COVID, when all the restaurants closed down, we also reopened our doors to our trainees that came through the Brownsville Community Culinary Center. And that's how we were able to expand from 200 meals a day to 2,000 meals a day, because we had a workforce of about 40 to 50 participants that actually, they're not participants anymore, they're alumni that came through our program, and they were able to help us push this entire initiative along. We're feeding so many different people. We would receive phone calls all the time because a great many food banks closed down. A lot of people didn't understand that. The funding for the food banks, the access to the food banks wasn't there. So we just created access.
Beautiful. Thanks, LaToya. Leandra, let's kick it over to you. Food Chain does similar work, and you've had a major shift in your operations. What was the unique gap that Food Chain stepped into initially, or some of the gaps? And how does local food and local entrepreneurs fit into that equation?
Great, thanks, Lily. Yeah, I relate to a lot of what LaToya says. We definitely have a lot of similar veins in our two organizations and a lot of similar observations of Food Chain, recognizing that the gaps created by COVID are not new gaps, but just the same gaps we've been working to combat for so long, blown wider, quicker, and more obvious to more people. And I think one of the unique opportunities of COVID is that it became more obvious to people with lots of money, and they actually decided that the local food system was worth investing in, which is actually a pretty awesome piece of that, of showing what can happen if people choose to invest in that. So with that, we pretty quickly, as soon as the shutdown was apparent, transitioned into working with one food pantry right off the bat that identified the gap of seniors who very quickly realized they couldn't leave their home. And a lot of low-income seniors who had relied on pantry supplies for their regular meals were now unable to go pick up from those pantries. So they not only needed food, but they needed food delivered. And a lot of them also needed, you know, comfort and company, but that wasn't able to be provided during the shutdown. So the idea of being able to provide comfort through a hot meal as opposed to a bag of potatoes really became this kind of on the forefront of our minds as we were thinking about how to address this. At the same time, we were receiving calls from all of the restaurants having to shut down about, you know, the amount of produce in their walk-ins that they didn't want to throw away. And because we already had established trust relationships with a lot of these restaurants, they knew that they could bring it to Food Chain and that it would find its way into the homes of people who needed it right then. And so that was a really important gap that we were able to bridge. And then as we continued down this road, the pantries were getting overwhelmed. Many who were run by elderly and senior volunteers weren't able to keep their doors open because of that labor force gap. And so we were, at the same time, there was an increased need and an increase in families who are experiencing this need who might not have permanent addresses, who might not have identification, and therefore didn't even qualify for the pantry boxes as they're distributed here in Lexington. And so finding a way to get them food sources, convenient food sources, a hot meal, a nutritious meal that didn't require an ID, didn't require any proof of income, didn't require anything except for you to walk up and say, I need a meal. So that was our first and foremost thought, as well as reaching out to the schools we were working with and finding out how children were getting access to meals. Shortly after the shutdown, the schools changed their model from one of everyday school bus stop delivery to children to where parents had to come pick up at schools. And so that exposed another big gap that we felt it was urgent for us to try to reach, is the children who are not able to travel to schools to pick up meals. Because we knew, especially in our neighborhood, the kids that live closest to us live very far away from any of the schools and would have to cross major streets by themselves in order to pick up these meals. And so we knew that it just wasn't realistic that they were able to access this source. So we really, you know, we saw this happening and saw the potential to access funding from people who saw these things happening as well and were also concerned. And so because we were able to be both on the ground and like viewing in real time the need, as well as having kind of our fingers on the pulse of where some of that funding was coming from because of other programs we've run other years with the city and local government, as well as the USDA Summer Food Service Program for kids, we were in this really awesome position to say, like, okay, we have access to funding and we know where meals need to go, but we don't have infinite capacity to be the only meal producer. But we know that there are tons of kitchens out there that want to keep their employees. So how can we, instead of saying, okay, we're going to make all of these meals and crowd our kitchen, which would also make it less safe from a COVID standpoint, we're just going to pay all these satellite kitchens to make these meals as well and connect them to the places of need, so that essentially we're just like building a relationship and then saying, like, we know how to pull down the funding for this, so we're going to build this relationship and make sure it is funded sustainably, and then we're going to walk away and let you guys make magical food full of nutritious restaurant quality ingredients and serve it to people for free and get paid, and like people are getting paid for that. And so that was the opportunity, the gap that really ended up being where we've generated a lot of the momentum around this movement. But one of the unique things is where we were processing seconds, we already had a relationship for bulk purchasing with farmers. And so we were also able to, in our meals, really focus on continuing that bulk purchasing and even increasing that in cases where farmers who are used to selling to institutions now had even more excess bulk, but our demand was so high that in some cases we were actually able to replace 3 to 4 restaurant contracts with our purchasing over the summer months.
Yeah, and that's key to those farmers. A lot of those, because I know the farmers, they were supporting UK and our cafeteria shut down, and it was a real hand wringer. How the plants are already in the ground. How are we going to pivot? And I'm struck, Leandra, there's a lot of parallels, and Latoya, with your example as well, of existing relationships and this idea of COVID didn't necessarily create new problems. It exacerbated the issues we've been dealing with for generations. And to pass things over to Mary, I mean, we have seen that Black and Indigenous communities in particular have been disproportionately affected by COVID, both from a health perspective and an economic perspective. And as Latoya mentioned at the opening, these are ongoing pandemics. And one thing we've heard through our research process is, yes, COVID's a pandemic layered on generations-long pandemics of racial injustice and inequality in our nation. So when we spoke, Mary, for the first time, you mentioned that there's some really unique and beautiful parts of your organization's work and the ways that you're connected to your community that help you best serve your community. And I was thinking of Leandra's example of caring for elders. And so can you talk us through how your approach is to supplemental nutrition assistance is unique? And so it predates COVID, but it is also expanding and enriching. So there's some really beautiful pieces around food sovereignty that your organization does.
Yes, I'd like to echo the sentiments of Latoya and share that for years, our ancestors lived off the land and provided sustainability for them, for their families. And we had our own food pathways that were disrupted from colonization. And some of that forced us to remove some healthy and nutritious food that was cultural to our sustainability. And so that disrupted pre-pandemic. So the pandemic only exacerbated an ongoing issue, as Latoya mentioned, that our communities face. We might have food accessibility and resources available, but community members don't always have transportation. There's no bus systems that are available. And so we try our best to reach those people and provide deliveries, especially for the elderly and the ones that are homebound. And it's tough. We have wheels moving through our communities, but not always in the right direction. So some of the ways that our leadership has worked to change some of the inequality in our food systems is to try to find ways that include traditional and culturally appropriate foods in our food package. And we've got the 638 and the 2018 Farm Bill for FDPIR. And so we can make those food packages more culturally appropriate, and tribes use those resources directly to also create some food security within our tribes. We have huge food insecurity, and the pandemic only identified that we need to start growing our own food and sourcing it locally. And so we're just waiting for, Congress has funded the 638 Farm Bill in the 2018 Farm Bill, but we're still working to try to get there. And it's a baby step, but we're trying to get that achieved through our communities and create resources for tribal community members to provide food. What better way to take care of our people by feeding them ourselves?
I love that. Can you talk a little bit more, Mary, about the grocery store model that you use for the distribution and how that plays into your community's experience?
So one of the things that when we relocated here 5 years ago, we established a grocery store concept that people are allowed to come in and shop and pick their own. Well, they've always been allowed to pick, but they're able to shop just like a grocery store. I always say we are the best grocery store because there is no fee at the end of checkout. So it allows accessibility to fresh produce. And many people have just one single fridge and freezer in their homes, so they don't have the ability to store. So instead of just getting canned foods. They can buy, or they can come back multiple times and get fresh and frozen products. So there's less waste and less spoilage that way too.
It's such a beautiful concept. I've seen some pictures and it's a beautiful store too. It just brings a lot of, really respects the clients and their dignity. It's a
Right.
beautiful program. Latoya, that reminds me of your Brownsville Fresh Food Box. You mentioned at the opening of this that, you know, going into emergency food often means shelf-stable products, which we know are not the most healthful. Some of them are tasty, but they're not always the most healthful. Can you walk us through that program a little bit more and how it works?
Absolutely. So the Brownsville Fresh Food Box, we're actually going through a bit of rebranding because we're expanding now. So we're actually moving into more of East Brooklyn because we're realizing that the need, this is back on education, right? In New York City, they've piloted several, I guess I'll give a little backstory. In New York City, they've piloted several farm to table programs, and you have a lot of nonprofits that work on these programs. But what is not being done is training. So you can give someone a butternut squash, you know, and they pay for it via SNAP, and then they take it home. They don't know how to cut that butternut squash. They don't know how to prepare the butternut squash. So it essentially goes to waste. It's not cooked where it's maintained its nutrient value. This is where we sort of have changed the model, because along with the $10 bag or the $7 SNAP EBT bag, you get classes from us. So we'll put a butternut squash in the bag, or we'll put some sunchokes in the bag. How do you make a sunchoke? And we're doing recipes. They get a recipe card, you get training, you get all sorts of things. So for your price of just $10, you're getting a full education behind why the food is, why the nutrients are in this, what the nutrients are in the food, what are the phytonutrients, why it's important to eat these vegetables while they're seasonal. The differences between what's in season, what's not in season, because it's from an education standpoint, creates advocates. So now we look at our entire food system, right? And we go, why is it that I can go to Whole Foods or somewhere in Park Slope and they have the freshest, best veggies, but yet in our community, we don't have those things? That's my CFO. So
Latoya has an absolutely gorgeous little baby boy over there, and we have met him. He may come on screen later, but he's putting his hand up saying, "Say it, Mom." That's exactly
right. How can someone know what is to be expected in the supermarkets in which they pay their consumer dollars if they have no idea what it is in the first place? So this is where the education comes, and why culinary training or health and nutrition training comes into play. And having people become advocates for the type of food that's found in their neighborhood. So this is the whole ideology behind the Brownsville Fresh Food Box, and the reason why we push it so hard, because yes, we could give the food away for free, and let me touch on that too. But there's another thing behind that, and I'm quite sure that Leandra and Mary will agree with me, is by creating an economy in the community, helps people understand the value behind the food that you're getting, and understand that there is some sort of transaction that goes behind so that the entire community can enjoy this food, and that this food is important for everyone's health and well-being.
I love that. That's perfect. Leandra, I see you nodding your head a lot, and you might have some thoughts in response. And I also want to, if you have an immediate response, go ahead and do it. And then I have a follow-up question.
I just wanted to say that, yeah, we have definitely seen that, one of the things that I like to say with this is there's no such thing as free food. Someone's paying for it. And I really, even more than ever, our workforce development, the folks that came through that program, who many times were, you use butternut squash as an example, Latoya, and that's one of the things that Food Chain has probably processed the most of and done the most diversity of things with. And so it becomes it becomes the biggest joke with all of our participants. So they're like, never in my life before would I have thought that I've seen 10,000 pounds of butternut squash. And you're like, yeah, here it is. It's in everything. But like people really do come to have a personal relationship with something like just the idea of butternut squash. And like it bleeds over into thinking more deeply about who grew it and where it came from, and recognizing it at the store and feeling excitement. And like, you know, once you're forming memories with the vegetables that are happy and are part of a learning experience, it creates this a much more meaningful relationship than, you know, when it's just like someone telling you, oh, like you should eat more vegetables, you know.
And to touch on what Leandra is saying, 10 times out of 10, when someone tells you they don't like a certain vegetable, it's because they had it prepared wrong. I guarantee you, hands down, and it's it. I don't care that, oh, I don't like broccoli. You didn't have roasted broccoli, you know, like.
Yes.
100%. And we've even had like, you know, almost all of our participants come through our workforce development program have said that same thing, LaToya. And when they come to that conclusion on their own, that's when you're like, ha.
Yes, exactly.
It's so
exactly.
beautiful. But yeah, and one of the things about the meals we've been providing is that people see and recognize that it's not those shelf-stable products that they're used to, that it's not a Ziploc baggie of processed chicken nuggets. And they recognize the healthfulness of the meals, and the care and just the presence of vegetables means that someone thought more about it than if it was just a baggie of French fries. And so I think that, yeah, the people who are receiving these meals do really see the value and feel the value and internalize that value, which is why programs like this are so important.
Since we've started I'm sorry, go ahead, Mary.
I was just going to add that one of the nutrition education opportunities that we're able to provide is we have that unique relationship with our clients that we have to see them. They have to see us. And so that every time they come to us or we go to them, we have that window of providing those nutrition education resources that are very important. And, you know, and nothing against SNAP, but they don't see the clients where we do face to face.
That's a great point, Mary. We've had a question in the chat about how public health is or could do a better job supporting this work around community food security and healthful food. Do any of you have examples of that, or where it's working well or where it could be better?
Well, I actually do. So amongst the other million things that we're doing, right, we're actually on the precipice of launching a whole new program in our space, along with our partners at the Beach.
How? Because
you know, I don't sleep. Stop it. Stop. It's good. It's just. But we're about to launch a whole new program, and basically it ties in health and food. What they say, let food be thy medicine, right? And 9 times out of 10, most diet-related illnesses, you know, are from the foods that our communities get, or the lack of education behind that food. So we're working along with Gotham Health, which will be Collective Fare will be preparing meals based upon nutritional values for diabetes, hypertension, and creating these prepared meals. This spun out of a conversation that when we started doing the meals for the COVID, for the emergency response, the seniors would call and be like, you know, since I've been getting your meals, I feel better. Like, you know, to hear that, to me, it's amazing, because it's like, you know, to me, we're just, like Leandra was saying, we're processing all of these fresh vegetables, we're processing all of this food, but we're also not thinking about what kind of programs they were on before. And that didn't care about the sodium count, didn't care about the amount of carbs, didn't care about the ratio of veggies. And when we give our containers, they're chock full of veggies. We use a lot of whole grains because we're interested in changing the type of food, but also due to COVID, boosting the immune system. because we knew that was extremely important. You know, it still is always important, but during that time, especially since the seniors were at the time stated they were being affected the hardest. So how do you change a community? You feed them well. You know what I mean? You give them the option to have culturally relevant food that's prepared in a healthy, nutritious manner, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Mary, let's bounce that back to you. That's a perfect reflection on it. And we've had a question about one nitty-gritty question about transportation, and Leandra and Latoya, you may have some solutions to this too, but in rural communities in particular, and as someone with elderly parents living in a rural area, how have you approached that transportation question? Because we know it's so vital. Do you have any creative solutions around that? And I'm also struck by this idea of culturally relevant food and caring for our community. So I'll follow up after we talk about transportation.
Was that for me?
Yeah, that's for you.
Yeah.
Sorry.
One of the opportunities we utilized was networking with tribal health and the senior program who delivers meals. So we shared resources and they helped us deliver food to a lot of the community members when we weren't able to. We had to close our doors. We didn't see the clients. We just brought food back out the front or out the side doors and loaded them in the trunk. And that isn't the way we've done business. But so using those other resources helped us reach more of our elderly clients. And we were able to get additional transportation vehicle with some of the CARES funding that we were afforded through the last CARES Act. So that helped us.
Any other examples of transportation our panelists want to chime in on?
Yeah, so we have had a pretty multifaceted approach to transportation for our meals. So initially at the beginning of COVID, we were getting meals out to pantries, and then the pantries were using a system of both volunteers as well as actually the sheriff's department stepped in, because a lot of times the sheriff's department, elderly seniors may call them if they're scared or if something is going wrong with them. So they're actually fielding a lot of the calls of homebound seniors, and so know where they're located. And so they actually stepped up in a big way to hand deliver meals. And then we also were working with volunteers who normally served at senior centers, who were willing to load up their trunk and go out. But one of the biggest responses we've seen in meal distribution assistance and volunteers are the meal recipients themselves. And so that's been one of the things that I am most proud of about this program, is that you can take as many meals as you need, no questions asked. So we're not like asking you to prove how many people in your household, because we know if you're taking a free meal, it's going somewhere that it needs to go. And that's the most important thing. So a lot of times we have folks who have come up and taken 50 meals and gone back to their street and been the source of food distribution for their neighbors. They'll load up extra meals and say, I'm just going to drop them off to all the guys under the bridge on my way home. And so that's been one of the most powerful things, is creating a system that allows the recipients themselves to also be points of distribution and be empowered, saying like, well, I know I have transportation right now, but I know a lot of people who don't. So I'm just going to get as many as I can so I can hand it out to anyone I know doesn't have transportation. And so that's been really powerful. In addition to that, Food Chain actually fundraised last year for a van to transport kids to our space for that nutrition education that we've been working on for 3 years of fundraising to get the van. And then as soon as we got the funding for it, we could no longer host kids in our space, but it's ended up being just the Meals on Wheels vehicle. And we're now doing a direct home delivery service for families and working to do those culturally appropriate meals. Because we're doing this delivery service, we're able to tailor meals to people's dietary restrictions, no gluten, no dairy, no pork, all of those things are able to be identified and provided to the families in a contactless way to increase the safety around COVID. So all of that van funding that was supposed to bring kids to classes in our kitchen is now bringing meals directly to their doors alongside education. So there's a lot of solutions needed for transportation, and definitely public transportation improvement in rural areas and urban areas across the board in the United States is super important and needed. But in the pandemic, even that is a very risky thing for seniors. So finding ways of engaging the community directly around transportation can be a super bright spot of inspiration and innovation.
Perfect. Mary, let's circle back to your work with some of the tribal food sovereignty and your work with the Native Farm Bill Coalition. It's a bit of an abrupt jump, but I want to, it's really, if we shift into our last part of this conversation of thinking into the future and what we're going to carry forward, how do you see your work? And I don't know how much you got to speak on the work with community gardening or procuring from Native farmers. What are you hoping for in the future, and how can those of us working in local food systems support that vision?
Well, the Native Farm Bill Coalition, which NAFDPR is a member, we serve over 170 member tribes with that coalition. And so together, we're always looking for opportunities for Indian country. And the coalition has raised awareness, and we've gotten the support of tribal leaders across the country. And some of the changes that we've implemented were the 638 opportunity for food sourcing, locally grown food through tribes. And we've also reduced the funding match for tribes that typically pay 25% match. We were able to get that reduced down to 20%. And we also changed the carryover to 2 years for an additional year instead of the 1 year. We were sometimes scrambling. If we weren't receiving funding till June or July, we had 3 months to spend that money. And if it wasn't obligated within a short time, the money was lost and returned back to USDA without reallocation. And so that was a huge leap for us. And another one was the grant waivers for the tribes that don't have the ability to match. They were able to grant hardship requests for the programs. And the economy is very unstable in Indian communities. The pandemic is really going to be another hardship that we just are barely digging ourselves out of many years of hardship. And many tribes have gaming, some have other business ventures, but that the pandemic has put a stop to a lot of those local resources. So those farm bill changes, we're going to keep working at those. One of the important pieces that I would like, when you were talking about nutrition education, is the ability for tribes to access the SNAP Ed funding. We currently don't have that ability. So that's something that we really need to work on, is for tribes to provide local nutrition education resources. Right now, it goes to the states, and the states have the say in where that money goes. It goes to a university, a land grant university, and the tribes are pretty much left out. Although we have the highest poverty in most states in our counties, we don't have a say where those dollars are used or how they're used.
Thanks for that insight, Mary. Latoya, I know you've got your CFO in your lap, but I wonder if we could bounce it back to you and also just share what you see carrying forward into the vision. You've got a lot of new pieces in play. If we think about food sovereignty for all communities, what's your hope for the future, and how can we support that vision?
Well, I think.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Mary.
I would just like to see increased opportunities for tribal and rural communities to establish the hydroponics, the aquaponics, the gardening, and that falls into the nutrition education piece where we can teach people how to be self-sufficient. If you have food in your cupboard, you won't go hungry. So that goes back to the nutrition education piece.
And I fully agree with everything that Mary said. I was gonna say the same thing. It is, but also like in places like New York where we have dense populations, it is important to maybe have food grown on this micro level. And that way communities have the ability to grow what is culturally relevant for their community, because we always have large pockets of certain cultures. And to teach people urban farming, when it comes to hydroponics, aquaponics, rooftop farming, bee farms, and all types of urban agriculture is stuff that we are actually working on right now in Brownsville and in East New York. To be able to show people and to create employment behind these food systems is going to be a way to pull everyone and create equity in the communities. We keep thinking of the industrial food complex as this grandiose thing that comes to us from up high. I don't think that's the way it should be. The future, and if COVID has showed us anything, is that communities should be empowered to be able to have food. That way we're not in emergency response mode. And we shouldn't have to always be in emergency response mode. That was the true crime, I think, is that we had to figure out what to do while other communities could waste the food. Other communities didn't have it to access in the first place. I see the future as very bright. I see the conversations that are being held right now. I see people. We want to talk about 10-year food policy. We want to talk about how do we take the government out of food and put the community back into food. These conversations, I sit on boards and panels, and trust me, I'm zooming all day. But the fact that these conversations are being held now is the innovation that we need. And then forming food cooperatives and gardening and urban gardenings, I believe that we're on the right track.
Perfect. Thanks, Latoya. Leandra, I mean, you're doing similar work too. And if we've gone from very rural to very urban to somewhere Lexington's at the middle, I don't know. I'll change the prompt a little bit. What is it about local food systems and the networks of partnerships that we form that you think can uniquely position organizations like Food Chain to respond in times of emergency, but also generally support food security? Like what messages can those of us advocating for this work take forward to say, we, as Latoya was saying, we shouldn't have to respond in emergency. This should be the way that we feed our communities all the time.
So yeah, I think the message that I would love to be carried out there is that, you know, if we can say that as a society, we agree that nutritious food is a human right, and that it's an important thing to have a resilient, thriving local food community, that the money out there exists to make that a reality. Like that there isn't a lack of resources that prevents that from happening. It's really just society calling for, saying that it is important that no matter whether you can financially afford nutritious food, that shouldn't prevent you from accessing it, and that is something that is worth investing in, and that resilient local food communities is something that is worth investing in as a society, because it is something that lifts us all up. And these kinds of social programs are not something that doesn't already exist in our society. So this isn't something that is outside of the realm of what the kind of social agreements that we have with each other about basic access points. We just have not yet recognized that shelter and food fall under those categories of what every human has a right to access, no matter whether they can afford it or not. One of the most important things I think is that these meals are available to everyone. And if you're a drug user, if you're a sex worker, if you're a child, if you're a grandparent raising children, if you're a child raising children, if you are a parent, if you are just a random guy on the street, if you're a family that looks like you have it all together, but you kind of don't. So everyone deserves a nutritious hot meal that's served with dignity and is made with love. And all of the workers along the food chain deserve access to a safe place to work that pays them a living wage. And the only way that that happens on all points is if we societally agree that this system is worth investing in. So I think that, like I said earlier, this has shown that the money is out there, and people are willing to say it's worth investing in an emergency situation. And so I think what we need to call out is that it's worth investing in at all times, because many of these families are living in this emergency situation with or without COVID. And until we address it, we're going to continue to build a society that's constantly operating in emergency mode instead of building strength and community together. So I really look forward to these conversations continuing to happen on a national level, and just so many people coming together and calling out that this is what's happening and this is what our communities need. They need access to nutritious foods, and they need access to jobs that pay them to work in a food system that respects their labor and the value of that labor.
And I want to tag on the back what she said is food insecure doesn't necessarily mean poverty. There was a lot of people that experienced food and nutrition insecurity, that had owned houses, that had families. It just took 1 week of closure, 1 month of closure, and it put them in the state that they're in. So this has no race, creed, color. This has no economic standard. This has nothing. This is basically how we here in America have looked at food, and how that needs to change tremendously for our communities, for our society, for our health.
Well, Mary, I would invite, if you have any final reflections, we're just about at time, but we have plenty of time if you have another final reflection you'd like to share, and then we'll wrap it up. I'm seeing all sorts of snaps and yeses and amens in the chat, so we're on a roll.
I agree with Leandra and Latoya, and I echoed that sentiment that the world has, the whole United States and the world has, felt food insecurity. They felt poverty. They felt fear going to the grocery store, and there's nothing there. And it might represent a grocery store, but for our community members, it's their cupboards at home that they've witnessed that firsthand, day after day. Part of the pandemic, when the schools were shut down, kids went without lunches for 5-7 days. Although there were waivers present, what does that mean? A kid can't eat a waiver, and that was disheartening. That there was not a more immediate response to children going hungry in our communities, and elders, and they feared going out. And so there needs to be a better way that we can feed our people, and make sure nobody goes hungry. The Farm to Families food box was billions of dollars that was influxed into for the farmers, and there's great pieces of that. And accessibility is still an issue. People were delivering for other families, and it takes that teamwork to get the food out to families. And if there's a bright spot in all of this, it's the United States turned into a big team. And I think together we can all keep building so we're all food secure, and we don't have to worry about anybody going hungry.
Perfect closure. I just want to extend my profound thanks to our three panelists, Leandra, Latoya, and Mary, for sharing from your wealth of personal experience. I will capture the chats and send it to our panelists because they've been sharing so much wisdom, and there's people are really feeling inspired by the work that you've shared. For folks who are interested in follow up, we'll have a recording and a written summary of today's conversation, although I don't know if we can capture the oomph, I don't know, the boost to our hearts that has happened in that. That'll be available on our website. You can join us in January. We'll be hearing from state departments of agriculture and farm institutions looking at how states are responding and how we can better connect. And a final thank you. We can all do a silent applause and just a moment of gratitude. And with that, I'll close our time today. Thank you all so much.